The wind howled through the canyon as Christina Hall stood frozen on the cabin's wooden porch, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Before her stood a mountain of a man, his weathered face partially hidden beneath a thick brown beard, his dark eyes holding secrets that seemed to stretch back through decades of wilderness solitude. His massive frame blocked out the dying sunlight, casting her in shadow, yet something about his presence felt achingly familiar. "I came to marry you," Aaron Patel said, his deep voice cutting through the mountain air with quiet certainty. The words hung between them like smoke from a dying fire, impossible and yet somehow inevitable. "You're the lost girl I rescued 23 years ago. You're Christina." The world tilted beneath her feet. 23 years. The fragments of memory she'd spent her entire adult life trying to piece together suddenly crystallized into sharp, painful clarity. The cave, the storm, the gentle giant who'd carried her to safety when she was nothing more than a terrified 8-year-old child, lost and alone in the unforgiving wilderness. Her knees threatened to buckle as the truth crashed over her like an avalanche. This man, this stranger who'd appeared at her door speaking of marriage, was the guardian angel from her fractured childhood memories. The one who'd saved her life and then vanished like morning mist, leaving her to wonder if he'd been real at all. But how had we arrived at this moment? How had the threads of fate woven themselves so intricately that a lost child and her mysterious rescuer would find each other again after more than 2 decades? The answer lay buried in the snow-covered peaks of memory, in a story that began with tragedy and survival, and now threatened to end with either redemption or heartbreak. 23 years earlier, the Colorado Rockies had been gripped by one of the worst early winter storms in recorded history. 8-year-old Christina Hall pressed herself deeper into the hollow of the massive pine tree, her small body shaking uncontrollably as the wind shrieked through the forest like a banshee. Her thin cotton dress, soaked through from the driving snow, offered no protection against the brutal cold that seemed to seep into her very bones. She'd been lost for 3 days now, ever since the wagon carrying her family toward their new homestead had overturned during the river crossing. The memory of that terrible moment played over and over in her mind like a nightmare that refused to end. The rushing water, her mother's screams, her father's desperate attempts to right the wagon before the current swept it away. And then the chaos, the confusion, and somehow in the midst of it all, she'd been separated from them, running blindly into the forest in her terror. For 3 days she'd wandered through the wilderness, calling out for her parents until her voice became nothing more than a whisper. She'd eaten nothing but a handful of bitter berries and snow, and now even the snow was too cold for her numb fingers to grasp. Her lips had turned blue, and she could no longer feel her feet inside her thin leather shoes. The storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it seemed to be growing stronger, the wind driving the snow horizontally through the trees with such force that she could barely keep her eyes open. She knew, with the terrible clarity that sometimes comes to children facing death, that she wasn't going to survive another night in the open. As darkness began to fall, painting the forest in shades of gray and black, Christina closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's face. The image was already growing fuzzy around the edges, like a photograph left too long in the sun. Soon, she thought, she would see her parents again, but not in the way she'd hoped. That's when she heard it, the sound of footsteps crunching through the snow, steady and purposeful, cutting through the howl of the wind. At first, she thought it might be another hallucination brought on by hunger and cold, but the footsteps grew closer, more distinct. Someone was out there in the storm, moving through the forest with the confidence of someone who belonged there. "Hello!" she tried to call out, but her voice was barely a whisper. She attempted to stand, to make herself visible, but her legs wouldn't support her weight. She collapsed back against the tree trunk, tears freezing on her cheeks as she realized she lacked even the strength to signal for help. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was only the wind and the driving snow. Then, through the white curtain of the storm, a figure emerged, tall and broad-shouldered, wrapped in thick furs and moving with the easy grace of someone completely at home in the wilderness. As he drew closer, she could make out more details. Dark hair, a full beard, and eyes that seemed to take in everything with a single glance. Aaron Patel had been tracking the storm for 2 days, reading the signs in the sky and the behavior of the animals with the instinct of someone who'd spent most of his 35 years in the mountains. He'd known it was going to be a bad one, the kind that claimed lives and left families mourning come spring. What he hadn't expected was to find a small girl, barely more than a child, dying slowly beneath a pine tree. His first thought was that she was already dead. Her skin had the waxy pallor of severe hypothermia, and she wasn't moving. But as he knelt beside her, he caught the faint mist of her breath in the frigid air. She was alive, but barely. "Easy there, little one," he said softly, his voice gentler than his imposing appearance might have suggested. "I've got you now." Christina's eyes fluttered open at the sound of his voice. Through the haze of cold and exhaustion, she saw a face that seemed carved from the mountain itself, weathered and strong, but with eyes that held unexpected kindness. She tried to speak, to tell him about her parents, about the wagon and the river, but no words would come. Aaron didn't need words to understand the situation. The girl's clothes, though of good quality, were completely inadequate for mountain weather. She was clearly not from these parts, probably from a family of settlers who'd underestimated the dangers of early winter travel. He'd seen it before, though rarely had he found survivors. Without hesitation, he shrugged off his heavy fur coat and wrapped it around her small frame. The coat was enormous on her, but it would trap what little body heat she had left. Then, with movements that were surprisingly gentle for such a large man, he lifted her into his arms. "We need to get you warm," he murmured, more to himself than to her. His cabin was still 2 miles away, but there was a cave system nearby that he'd used as shelter before. It would have to do until the worst of the storm passed. As he carried her through the blinding snow, Christina drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes she was aware of the steady rhythm of his breathing, the solid warmth of his chest against her cheek. Other times, she seemed to float in a gray space between waking and sleeping, where her parents' voices called to her from a great distance. The cave Aaron had in mind was more of a deep overhang in the rock face, but it provided crucial shelter from the wind and driving snow. He'd cached supplies there before, knowing that the mountains could be unpredictable and deadly. Working quickly, he built a fire from the dry wood he'd stored, coaxing it to life with the skill of long practice. Once the flames were dancing steadily, casting warm light on the stone walls, he turned his attention to the girl. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, and when he touched her forehead, her skin felt like ice. Hypothermia had advanced further than he'd initially thought. She needed warmth, and she needed it fast. Aaron had dealt with hypothermia before, both in animals and in the occasional lost traveler he'd encountered over the years. He knew that warming someone too quickly could be as dangerous as leaving them cold, but he also knew that this child was running out of time. Her pulse was weak and thready, and her lips had taken on an alarming blue tint. He positioned her close to the fire, but not so close that the sudden heat would shock her system. Then he began the careful process of removing her wet clothes, replacing them with dry garments from his pack. The clothes were far too large for her small frame, but they were warm and dry, which was what mattered. As he worked, he found himself studying her face. She couldn't be more than 8 or 9 years old, with delicate features and long dark hair that was matted with snow and ice. There was something about her that reminded him of his younger sister, who died in a fever epidemic when he was barely 20. The memory was old and scarred over, but it still had the power to make his chest tighten with grief. "What's your name, little one?" he asked softly, though he didn't expect an answer. She was too far gone to respond, lost somewhere in the gray twilight between consciousness and oblivion. But to his surprise, her lips moved slightly. "Christina?" she whispered, the word barely audible above the crackling of the fire. "Christina," he repeated, testing the name. "That's a pretty name. I'm Aaron. You're safe now, Christina. I'm going to take care of you." He wasn't sure if she heard him, but something in her face seemed to relax slightly, as if his words had reached her, even in her semi-conscious state. He continued to talk to her as he worked, his deep voice a steady counterpoint to the storm raging outside the cave. "I've been living in these mountains for 15 years now," he told her, checking her pulse again and finding it slightly stronger. "Came up here after the war, looking for peace and quiet. Found more of both than I bargained for, I suppose. Most folks think I'm half wild by now, and maybe they're not wrong. He built up the fire higher, ensuring that the warmth would reach every corner of their small shelter. Then he settled back against the cave wall, keeping watch over his unexpected charge. The storm outside showed no signs of abating, and he knew they'd be here for at least the night, possibly longer. As the hours passed, Christina's condition slowly began to improve. Her breathing became more regular, and some color returned to her cheeks. Twice she stirred, her eyes opening briefly to look at him, with a mixture of confusion and trust that made something twist in his chest. "Mama?" she whispered the second time she woke, her voice small and lost. "She's not here right now," Aaron said gently, not wanting to lie to her but also not ready to discuss what had likely happened to her family. "But you're safe. I won't let anything hurt you." She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether she could believe him. Then, apparently satisfied with what she saw, she closed her eyes and drifted back to sleep. Aaron kept his vigil through the night, feeding the fire and monitoring her condition. He'd found himself in many strange situations during his years in the mountains, but caring for a lost child was a new experience. He felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar burden. This little girl's life was in his hands, and he was determined not to fail her. By morning, the storm had finally begun to weaken. The wind no longer howled through the rocks with quite the same ferocity, and the snow had changed from the driving horizontal sheets of the night before to a gentler, more vertical fall. Christina was awake and alert, though still weak from her ordeal. "Are you hungry?" Aaron asked, offering her some jerky from his supplies. She nodded eagerly, and he watched with satisfaction as she ate, her appetite a good sign that she was recovering. As she ate, she began to talk, telling him about her family and their journey west, about the accident at the river crossing, and her terrifying days alone in the forest. "I couldn't find them," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. "I looked and looked, but they were gone." Aaron's heart clenched at the pain in her voice. He'd suspected as much, but hearing her confirm it made the tragedy real. A family destroyed, parents likely dead, and this child left alone in the world. It was a story he'd heard too many times during his years in the wilderness. "I'm sorry, little one," he said quietly. "I'm truly sorry." They spent another day in the cave while Aaron waited for the weather to clear completely. He used the time to assess Christina's condition and to decide what to do with her. The nearest town was Millbrook, about 20 miles down the mountain, but the journey would be treacherous in the aftermath of the storm. Still, she couldn't stay with him. A rough mountain man was no fit guardian for a young girl, and she deserved a chance at a normal life. On the third morning, the sun finally broke through the clouds, painting the snow-covered landscape in brilliant shades of gold and white. Aaron judged the conditions safe enough for travel, though it would still be a difficult journey. "We're going to take you to town," he told Christina as he packed up their supplies. "There are good people there who will take care of you." Her face fell at his words. "Can't I stay with you?" she asked. "I don't want to go with strangers." The question hit him harder than he'd expected. In the 3 days they'd spent together, he'd grown attached to the brave little girl who'd survived against impossible odds. But he knew he wasn't the right person to raise her. His life was solitary by choice, suited to a man who'd seen too much of war and death to be comfortable around civilization. "I live alone up here," he explained gently. "It's no place for a little girl. You need to be around other children, go to school, have a proper home." Christina's lower lip trembled, but she nodded with a maturity that was heartbreaking in someone so young. "Will I see you again?" she asked. Aaron hesitated. He wanted to promise her that he would visit, that he wouldn't simply disappear from her life, but he knew better than to make promises he might not be able to keep. The mountains were dangerous, and his way of life was unpredictable. "Maybe," he said finally, "if you're ever in trouble, real trouble, you call for me. I'll hear you." It was a foolish thing to say, the kind of promise that belonged in fairy tales rather than the harsh reality of frontier life. But something in her eyes made him want to give her hope, even if it was built on fantasy. The journey down the mountain was long and difficult. Aaron fashioned a makeshift sled to carry Christina when she grew too tired to walk, pulling her through the snow with the same steady determination that had characterized everything else about their time together. They stopped frequently to rest and to ensure she wasn't becoming too cold or exhausted. As they traveled, Aaron found himself memorizing details about her. The way she bit her lower lip when she was thinking, the sound of her laugh when he told her stories about the animals he'd encountered in the mountains, the trust in her eyes when she looked at him. He told himself it was just to ensure he'd recognize her if their paths ever crossed again. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. Millbrook was a small but thriving settlement nestled in a valley between two mountain ranges. It had grown up around a lumber mill, and the steady stream of settlers heading west had turned it into a proper town with a church, a school, and several businesses. Aaron rarely ventured into town, preferring to trade with the isolated homesteaders who lived closer to his territory, but he knew enough about Millbrook to believe Christina would find a good home there. The first person they encountered was Martha Campbell, the town's school teacher and unofficial guardian of orphan children. She was a stern-looking woman in her 40s, but Aaron had heard that she had a kind heart beneath her no-nonsense exterior. "Good heavens," Martha exclaimed when she saw them approaching. "Aaron Patel, is that you? And who is this little one?" Aaron explained the situation as briefly as possible, leaving out some of the more harrowing details of Christina's ordeal. Martha listened with growing concern, her eyes soft with sympathy as she looked at the girl. "Of course we'll take care of her," Martha said without hesitation. "Poor child, she's been through enough trauma to last a lifetime. Come inside, both of you. Let's get her warm and fed." Martha's house was small but comfortable, filled with the kind of domestic touches that Aaron's cabin lacked. There were curtains at the windows, rugs on the floors, and the smell of fresh bread coming from the kitchen. Christina looked around with wide eyes, taking in this glimpse of the normal childhood she'd been denied. Over the next few hours, Aaron watched as Martha and several other women from the town fussed over Christina, providing her with clean clothes, a hot meal, and the kind of gentle attention she desperately needed. He could see that she was in good hands, that these people would care for her and give her the life she deserved. But as the time came for him to leave, Aaron found himself reluctant to go. Christina had been quiet during the afternoon, answering questions politely, but staying close to his side whenever possible. Now, as he prepared to return to his mountain solitude, she looked at him with eyes that seemed far too old for her young face. "You're leaving now, aren't you?" she said. Aaron nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. "You'll be happy here," he managed to say. "These are good people. They'll take care of you." Christina stepped forward and wrapped her small arms around his waist, hugging him with desperate intensity. "Thank you," she whispered against his coat. "Thank you for saving me." Aaron knelt down to her level, his large hands gentle on her small shoulders. "You saved yourself, little one," he said quietly. "You're the bravest person I've ever met. Don't you ever forget that." He reached into his pack and pulled out a small carved wooden figure, a bear he'd whittled during the long winter evenings in his cabin. "This is for you," he said, pressing it into her hands, "to remember that you're stronger than you know." Christina clutched the carving to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "I'll never forget you," she promised. Aaron stood and turned to Martha. "Take good care of her," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "We will," Martha assured him. "She'll want for nothing here." As Aaron walked away from the house, he could hear Christina calling after him, her voice growing fainter as the distance between them increased. He didn't look back, knowing that if he did, he might not have the strength to leave. But her voice followed him long after he could no longer hear it, echoing in his mind as he made his solitary way back up the mountain. The years that followed were kind to Christina Hall, though the memories of her early trauma never completely faded. Martha Campbell proved to be everything Aaron had hoped she would be, and more. She was patient with Christina's nightmares, understanding about her need for security, and determined to give her every opportunity to build a new life. Christina proved to be a bright student, eager to learn and quick to make friends with the other children in Millbrook. She threw herself into her studies with the intensity of someone who understood that education was a privilege not to be taken lightly. Martha often found her reading by candlelight long after she should have been asleep, devouring books with an appetite that seemed insatiable. But despite her success in adapting to town life, Christina never forgot the mountain man who had saved her. She kept Aaron's carved bear on her bedside table, And sometimes Martha would find her staring out the window toward the high peaks, as if she expected to see his familiar figure emerging from the wilderness. As she grew older, Christina began to ask questions about her rescuer. What was his full name? Where exactly did he live? Did anyone in town know him well enough to send a message? Martha answered what questions she could, but the truth was that Aaron Patel was something of a mystery even to the longtime residents of Millbrook. He's been up there for as long as anyone can remember, Martha explained when Christina was 12, and particularly persisted in her questioning. Some say he fought in the war, others that he lost his family to illness. He keeps to himself mostly, though he's helped folks out of tight spots before. Mountain people have their own way of living, Christina. It's not for everyone. But he saved my life, Christina insisted. Doesn't that mean something? Shouldn't I at least be able to thank him properly? Martha's expression softened. She understood the girl's need for closure, her desire to maintain some connection to the man who had literally carried her out of death's embrace. But she also knew that some people chose solitude for reasons that were too painful to share, and it wasn't her place to intrude on Aaron's chosen isolation. Perhaps someday, Martha said gently, when you're older, when you understand better what it means to respect someone's choices about how they want to live their life. Christina had to content herself with that non-answer, but she never stopped hoping that she would see Aaron again. She imagined elaborate scenarios where she would encounter him in the woods, or he would appear in town on some errand, or she would somehow find her way to his cabin. In her daydreams, she was always older, more capable, able to express her gratitude in ways that her 8-year-old self had been unable to manage. When Christina turned 16, Martha began to worry about her ward's romantic future. The girl was undeniably beautiful, with the kind of refined features and graceful bearing that attracted attention from young men throughout the valley. But Christina seemed remarkably uninterested in the boys her own age, politely declining invitations to social gatherings and showing little enthusiasm for the courtship rituals that occupied most girls her age. "Is there someone special you're thinking about?" Martha asked one evening as they sat together, mending clothes by the fire. Christina looked up from her sewing, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "Not exactly," she said carefully. "Not exactly?" Martha pressed gently. "That's an interesting way to put it." Christina set down her needlework and stared into the flames. "Sometimes I wonder what happened to him," she said quietly. "The man who saved me. I wonder if he ever thinks about that little girl he found in the storm." Martha felt her heart sink. She'd suspected that Christina's disinterest in local suitors might be connected to her childhood trauma, but she'd hoped the girl would outgrow what was essentially an idealized memory of her rescuer. "Christina," she said carefully, "you were very young when that happened. Sometimes our memories of traumatic events can become confused with our feelings about them. Gratitude can feel like something else entirely." "I know the difference between gratitude and—" Christina trailed off, apparently unable to finish the sentence. "And what?" Martha prompted. Christina shook her head. "It doesn't matter. He probably doesn't even remember me." But Aaron Patel remembered everything about the lost girl he'd rescued 8 years earlier. Not a day passed that he didn't think about Christina, wondering how she was growing up, whether she was happy, if she ever thought about the 3 days they'd spent together in the cave and on the journey down the mountain. He'd made discreet inquiries over the years, trading information with the few mountain dwellers who occasionally ventured into Millbrook. He knew she was doing well in school, that she was considered one of the prettiest girls in town, that Martha Campbell had been a devoted guardian. The knowledge should have been enough to satisfy him, but somehow it only made him want to know more. Aaron had convinced himself that his interest in Christina's welfare was purely paternal, the natural concern of someone who had played a role in saving her life. But as the years passed and she grew from child to young woman, he found himself struggling with feelings that were far more complex than simple protectiveness. He told himself he was being foolish, that the gap in their ages and circumstances made any deeper connection impossible. She was a town girl now, educated and refined, destined for a life among civilized people. He was a rough mountain man who had chosen isolation over society, whose hands were more familiar with traps and rifles than with the gentle courtesies of polite interaction. But logic couldn't entirely suppress the dreams that came to him in the long winter nights, dreams where she appeared as a grown woman, beautiful and strong, looking at him with the same trust she'd shown as a child. He would wake from these dreams with a mixture of longing and self-recrimination, reminding himself that such fantasies were not only inappropriate, but potentially harmful to them both. As Christina approached her 18th birthday, the pressure from well-meaning townspeople for her to consider marriage began to intensify. Millbrook was a small community, and eligible young women were expected to settle down and start families within a reasonable time frame. Several respectable young men had expressed interest in courting her, but Christina continued to deflect their advances with polite but firm refusals. "I'm not ready," she would tell Martha when the subject came up. "I want to see more of the world first. Maybe travel east to visit the cities I've read about in books." Martha understood the desire for adventure that often seized young people, but she also worried about Christina's tendency to live in her imagination rather than engaging with the real world around her. The girl had always been something of a dreamer, but lately her detachment from local social life had become more pronounced. "There's nothing wrong with wanting to see the world," Martha said during one of their increasingly frequent conversations about Christina's future. "But you can't spend your whole life waiting for something that may never come." "What do you mean?" Christina asked, though her defensive tone suggested she knew exactly what Martha was getting at. "I think you're still waiting for your mountain man to come riding down from the peaks like some kind of fairy tale prince," Martha said gently. "But real life doesn't work that way, dear. People make choices about how they want to live, and we have to respect those choices even when they disappoint us." Christina felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You think I'm being foolish?" "I think you're being human," Martha replied. "It's natural to idealize someone who saved your life, especially when you were so young and vulnerable. But you're a woman now, Christina, with your own life to live. You can't spend it pining for someone who may not even exist anymore." The words stung because Christina feared they might be true. It had been 10 years since Aaron had carried her out of the mountains. He could be dead, or married, or simply completely uninterested in the child he'd once helped. Her memories of him might be nothing more than the fantasies of a traumatized little girl, enhanced and distorted by years of wishful thinking. But even as she acknowledged the logic of Martha's concerns, Christina couldn't bring herself to abandon hope entirely. Something deep inside her insisted that her connection to Aaron was real, that the feelings she'd carried for him all these years were based on more than just childhood trauma and romantic fantasy. The crisis came in the spring of Christina's 18th year, when Eric Hughes, the son of Millbrook's most prosperous merchant, formally asked for her hand in marriage. Eric was everything a sensible young woman should want in a husband: handsome, well-educated, financially secure, and genuinely kind. He'd been patient with Christina's previous rejections, but now he was making it clear that he expected a definitive answer. "I can't keep waiting forever," he told her during a walk through the town's small park. "I care about you too much to settle for uncertainty. If you don't think you could ever return my feelings, I need to know so I can move on with my life." Christina looked at Eric's earnest face and felt a familiar stab of guilt. He deserved better than her half-hearted attention, better than a woman whose heart was fixed on a memory that might not even be real. "You're a good man, Eric," she said quietly. "Any woman would be lucky to have you." "But not you," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "I'm not ready for marriage," Christina said, the same excuse she'd been using for months. "I need more time." "Time for what?" Eric asked, his patience finally beginning to fray. "Christina, we've known each other for years. If you don't know by now whether you could care for me, more time isn't going to change anything." He was right, and they both knew it. Christina felt trapped between her inability to let go of the past and her reluctance to hurt someone who genuinely cared about her. The weight of everyone's expectations pressed down on her like a physical burden, making it hard to breathe. That night, she sat by her bedroom window, staring up at the mountain peaks that rose like dark shadows against the star-filled sky. Somewhere up there, Aaron Patel might be looking at the same stars, thinking his own thoughts about the paths their lives had taken. Or he might be dead, or gone, or completely indifferent to the girl he'd rescued so long ago. "I have to know," she whispered to the darkness. "I have to find out for sure." The decision, once made, filled her with a mixture of terror and excitement. She would go into the mountains and find Aaron's cabin, confront him face to face, and finally get the answers she needed to move forward with her life. If he rejected her, if he told her that she meant nothing to him, at least she would know. At least she could stop living in the limbo of uncertainty. Planning the expedition took weeks of careful preparation. Christina had to acquire supplies without arousing Martha's suspicion, study maps of the high country, and choose a time when her absence wouldn't be immediately noticed. She settled on the annual church retreat, a 3-day event that would give her enough time to make the journey up the mountain and back. The morning of her departure, Christina left a letter for Martha explaining her intentions and promising to return safely. She knew her guardian would be furious and worried, but she also knew that Martha would understand, eventually, why this journey was necessary. As she set out from Millbrook in the pre-dawn darkness, Christina felt as if she were finally taking control of her own destiny. For 10 years, she'd been passive, waiting for something to happen, hoping that fate would somehow bring her and Aaron together again. Now she was taking action, pursuing the answers she needed regardless of the risk involved. The trail up the mountain was more difficult than she'd anticipated. Christina was in good physical condition from years of helping Martha with household chores and tending their small garden, but hiking at altitude with a full pack was exhausting work. By midday, her legs were aching and her lungs were burning from the thin air, but she pressed on, driven by a determination that surprised her with its intensity. This wasn't just about finding Aaron anymore. It was about proving to herself that she was capable of more than the quiet, conventional life that everyone expected her to live. As the day wore on and Christina climbed higher into the mountains, the landscape around her began to change in ways that stirred half-buried memories. The scent of pine and snow, the particular quality of light at high altitude, the sound of wind through the peaks all combined to transport her back to that terrifying and transformative time when she was 8 years old. She began to recognize specific landmarks from her journey down the mountain with Aaron 10 years earlier. There was the distinctive rock formation that looked like a sleeping giant, the grove of aspen trees whose leaves had been turning gold even in the early autumn, the stream that had provided them with fresh water during their descent. Each familiar sight filled her with a mixture of nostalgia and anticipation. By late afternoon, Christina was exhausted and beginning to worry that she'd overestimated her ability to find Aaron's cabin. The mountains were vast and unforgiving, full of hidden valleys and false trails that could lead an inexperienced hiker astray. She'd been following what she hoped was the right path, but doubt was beginning to creep into her mind. Just as she was considering the possibility that she might need to turn back, she caught sight of smoke rising from a stand of trees about half a mile ahead. Her heart leaped with excitement and relief. Smoke meant a fire, and a fire meant human habitation. It had to be Aaron's cabin. She pushed forward with renewed energy, ignoring her aching muscles and the growing chill of the mountain evening. As she drew closer to the source of the smoke, she could make out the outline of a log structure nestled among the trees. It was larger than she'd expected, more of a house than a cabin, with a stone chimney and what appeared to be several outbuildings. Christina paused at the edge of the clearing, suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was about to do. For 10 years, she dreamed of this moment, but now that it was actually happening, she felt paralyzed by uncertainty. What if Aaron didn't remember her? What if he was angry that she'd intruded on his solitude? What if the feelings she'd carried for him all these years were nothing more than the romantic fantasies of a lonely girl? Before she could lose her nerve entirely, the door of the cabin opened and a man stepped out onto the porch. Even at a distance, she recognized him immediately. He was older, of course, his hair now streaked with silver and his face more deeply lined, but there was no mistaking the broad shoulders and confident bearing that had been burned into her memory. Aaron Patel stood on his porch, apparently unaware of her presence, and Christina felt her heart stop beating for a moment. He was real. After all these years of wondering and dreaming, he was actually there, solid and substantial and undeniably alive. As if sensing her gaze, Aaron looked up and scanned the tree line. His eyes found her almost immediately, and Christina saw his entire body go rigid with shock. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the clearing. Two people separated by a decade of time and 100 yards of mountain meadow. Then Aaron began walking toward her, his movements deliberate and careful, as if he were approaching a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden motion. Christina found herself rooted to the spot, unable to move or speak or even breathe properly. "Christina?" Aaron's voice carried across the clearing, rough with disbelief. "Is that really you?" She nodded, not trusting her voice to work. As he drew closer, she could see the changes that 10 years had wrought in his appearance. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, and his beard was now more silver than brown. But his eyes were the same, dark and intelligent, and filled with the same unexpected gentleness she remembered. "What are you doing here?" he asked when he was close enough for normal conversation. "Is everything all right? Are you in trouble?" The concern in his voice was immediate and genuine, and Christina felt some of her nervousness begin to fade. This was the same man who had carried her through a blizzard and sat up all night to make sure she didn't die of hypothermia. Whatever else had changed, his fundamental kindness remained intact. "I'm not in trouble," she said, finding her voice at last. "I came to find you. I've been wanting to see you for years." Aaron's expression was unreadable. "You've grown up," he said quietly, his eyes taking in her adult appearance with what might have been surprise or something deeper. "I'm 18 now," Christina said, then immediately felt foolish for stating the obvious. 18, Aaron repeated, as if testing the word. "Martha Campbell did well by you. You look healthy and happy." "I am healthy," Christina said, "but I'm not sure about happy." Something flickered in Aaron's eyes at her words. "What do you mean?" Christina took a deep breath, knowing that this was her moment to say everything she'd come here to say. "I never forgot you," she began. "All these years, I've thought about you every single day. I've wondered where you were, what you were doing, whether you ever thought about the little girl you saved." Aaron's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Christina," he said carefully, "you were a child when we met. Sometimes children develop attachments that aren't based on reality. I'm not a child anymore," Christina said firmly, "and my feelings aren't based on fantasy. I know the difference between gratitude and something deeper." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Aaron looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant peaks, as if seeking guidance from the mountains themselves. "You should go back to town," he said finally. "This isn't a place for a young lady, and I'm not the kind of man you should be associating with." "What kind of man are you?" Christina asked. Aaron turned back to her, and she was surprised to see something like pain in his eyes. "I'm a man who's lived alone for 15 years because I chose to," he said. "I'm rough and unsocialized and set in my ways. You deserve better than that. You deserve someone who can give you a proper life." "What if I don't want a proper life?" Christina challenged. "What if I want something different?" Aaron stared at her for a long moment, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. The girl he'd rescued had been small and fragile, dependent on his protection for her very survival. The woman standing before him now was strong and determined, capable of hiking alone into dangerous mountain country to confront him about feelings he'd spent years trying to suppress. "You don't know what you're saying," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I know exactly what I'm saying," Christina replied. "I've had 10 years to think about it. I've been courted by respectable men, offered everything a woman is supposed to want, and none of it meant anything to me, because my heart was already given." "To a memory," Aaron said desperately. "To an idealized version of someone you knew for 3 days when you were 8 years old." "Then prove me wrong," Christina challenged. "Let me stay here for a few days. Let me get to know the real Aaron Patel, not the memory I've been carrying. If you're right, if I've been chasing a fantasy all these years, then I'll know it, and I can finally move on with my life." Aaron felt the walls he'd built around his heart beginning to crumble. For 10 years, he'd told himself that his feelings for Christina were inappropriate, that the age difference and their circumstances made any relationship between them impossible. But she was 18 now, legally an adult, capable of making her own choices about her life and her heart. "It's not safe," he said, grasping for reasons to send her away before he did something they might both regret. "These mountains are dangerous, especially for someone who's not used to wilderness living." "I survived them once before," Christina pointed out, "with your help. That was different. You were a child, and I was responsible for keeping you alive. Now," he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Now what?" Christina pressed. Aaron looked at her standing there in the fading light, beautiful and determined and utterly fearless, and felt his resolve crumbling completely. Now I'm not sure I can trust myself to be a gentleman, he admitted. The honesty in his voice sent a thrill through Christina that she tried to hide. Maybe I don't want you to be a gentleman, she said quietly. The words hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Aaron felt desire and protectiveness and a dozen other emotions warring in his chest. Christina was offering him something he'd dreamed about but never dared to hope for, and every instinct he possessed was screaming at him to take what she was willing to give. But his conscience wouldn't let him accept so easily. Christina, he said carefully, you need to understand what you're suggesting. I'm not a young man anymore. I'm 45 years old, set in my ways, used to solitude. I don't know how to court a lady or make pretty speeches. If you stayed here, if something developed between us, it wouldn't be like the fairy tale romances you've read about in books. I don't want a fairy tale, Christina said. I want something real. I want you. The simple declaration nearly undid him completely. Aaron had spent years convincing himself that his feelings for Christina were one-sided, that she saw him only as a childhood protector rather than as a man. To hear her speak so directly about her desires was both thrilling and terrifying. You could have any man you wanted, he said. Why would you choose someone like me? Christina stepped closer to him, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. Because you're the only man who's ever made me feel truly safe, she said. Because when I think about the future, I can't imagine it without you in it. Because I've been in love with you since I was 8 years old, and that feeling has only grown stronger as I've gotten older. Aaron felt his last defenses crumble at her words. He reached out and touched her face, his calloused fingers gentle against her soft skin. You're sure about this? He asked. Once you cross this line, there's no going back. I won't be able to let you go again. I don't want to go back, Christina said, leaning into his touch. I want to go forward with you. Aaron studied her face for a long moment, looking for any sign of doubt or uncertainty. But all he saw was love and determination and a strength that took his breath away. This wasn't the frightened little girl he'd rescued 10 years ago. This was a woman who knew her own mind and had chosen him despite all the rational arguments against it. All right, he said finally. You can stay, but we do this properly. You'll sleep in the guest room, and we'll take time to get to know each other as adults before we make any permanent decisions. Christina smiled, the first truly happy smile he'd seen from her since her arrival. I'd like that, she said. As they walked together toward his cabin, Aaron felt a mixture of joy and terror that he'd never experienced before. He was about to embark on the most important relationship of his life, with a woman who had the power to either heal his lonely heart or destroy it completely. But as he looked at Christina walking beside him, her face glowing with happiness and determination, he knew that whatever happened next, he wouldn't trade this moment for anything in the world. The cabin was warm and comfortable, filled with the kind of simple, functional furniture that Aaron had crafted himself over the years. Christina looked around with obvious interest, taking in the details of the life he'd built in solitude. There were books on the shelves more than she'd expected, and the walls were decorated with maps and sketches of the surrounding wilderness. It's beautiful, she said, and Aaron could tell she meant it. It's simple, he replied. I don't need much. Neither do I, Christina said, meeting his eyes. Not as long as I have what matters most. The next few days passed in a blur of discovery and growing intimacy. Aaron showed Christina around his property, explaining how he'd built the cabin and outbuildings, how he managed to survive the harsh mountain winters, how he'd learned to read the signs of weather and wildlife that kept him safe in the wilderness. Christina was an eager student, asking intelligent questions and showing genuine interest in every aspect of his life. In return, she told him about her years in Millbrook, about Martha's kindness and the education she'd received, about her dreams and ambitions, and the growing sense that conventional town life wasn't meant for her. Aaron listened with fascination, marveling at the articulate, thoughtful woman she'd become. I always knew you were special, he told her one evening as they sat by the fire after dinner. Even when you were 8 years old, there was something about you that was different from other children. You had a strength that most adults never develop. I learned it from you, Christina said. Those 3 days we spent together taught me more about courage and resilience than all my years of schooling combined. Aaron felt his heart clench at her words. I was just doing what anyone would have done, he said. No, Christina said firmly. Most people would have left me to die rather than risk their own safety. You chose to save me, and then you chose to care for me. And then you chose to make sure I had a good life, even though it meant giving me up. Those weren't the actions of just anyone. They were the actions of a truly good man. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching the cabin. Aaron immediately went on alert, reaching for the rifle he kept by the door. Visitors were rare in his part of the mountains, and unexpected guests usually meant trouble. Stay inside, he told Christina as he stepped out onto the porch. 3 men on horseback emerged from the tree line, and Aaron recognized them immediately. They were bounty hunters, the kind of men who made their living tracking down fugitives and collecting rewards from territorial authorities. He'd had dealings with their type before, and none of those encounters had been pleasant. Aaron Patel, the lead rider called out. He was a thin, weaselly man with cold eyes and a permanent sneer. I'm Samuel Thompson. These are my associates, Ethan Reyes and Stephen Cox. We're looking for a young woman who went missing from Millbrook 3 days ago. Christina Hall, pretty girl, dark hair, about 18 years old. Aaron's blood ran cold. He'd known that Christina's absence would eventually be noticed, but he'd hoped they would have more time before anyone came looking for her. Don't know anyone by that name, Aaron said, keeping his voice level and his expression neutral. Samuel's sneer widened. Funny thing about that, he said. The school teacher in town, Martha Campbell, she seemed to think you might know something about the girl's whereabouts. Seems the girl left a letter mentioning you specifically. Aaron cursed silently. He should have anticipated that Christina would leave some kind of explanation for her departure. Martha Campbell was a smart woman. She would have put the pieces together quickly. Like I said, Aaron repeated, I don't know anyone by that name. Mind if we take a look around? Samuel asked, though his tone made it clear it wasn't really a request. Just to satisfy our curiosity. I mind very much, Aaron said, his hand moving closer to his rifle. This is private property, and you're not welcome here. The tension in the clearing ratcheted up several notches. The 3 bounty hunters exchanged glances, clearly debating whether to press the issue. Aaron was outnumbered, but his reputation in these mountains was formidable, and smart men didn't pick fights with him unless they were very sure they could win. Now there's no need for unpleasantness, Samuel said, though his hand had moved to rest on the butt of his pistol. We're just trying to help a worried guardian find her missing ward. Surely you can understand that. What I understand, Aaron said coldly, is that you're trespassing on my land and making accusations without proof. I suggest you move along before this conversation takes a turn you won't like. For a moment it seemed as though the situation might escalate into violence. Then Samuel apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor. We'll be back, he promised, wheeling his horse around, with a warrant and more men. If that girl is here, we'll find her. Aaron watched them ride away, his mind racing. He had maybe a day, possibly 2, before they returned with legal authority and enough firepower to search his property thoroughly. Christina would have to leave, and soon, or they'd both be in serious trouble. He found her waiting just inside the door, her face pale but determined. I heard everything, she said before he could speak. I have to go back, don't I? Aaron nodded grimly. If you don't, they'll arrest both of us. Me for kidnapping, you for... I'm not sure what they'd charge you with. But it wouldn't be pleasant. Christina's shoulders sagged with disappointment. So that's it? 3 days? And then it's over? Not over, Aaron said, pulling her into his arms. Never over. But we need to be smart about this. You go back to town, face whatever consequences there are for your disappearance, and then we figure out our next move. What if Martha won't let me see you again? Christina asked, her voice small and frightened. Then we'll find another way, Aaron promised. I'm not giving up on us, Christina. Not now that I know what we could have together. They spent that night talking and planning, trying to figure out how to navigate the social and legal obstacles that stood between them and their future together. By morning, they had the outline of a plan, though both of them knew it would require patience and careful maneuvering to succeed. Aaron would escort Christina back to the edge of Millbrook, close enough that she could return on her own, but far enough away that he wouldn't be seen by the townspeople. She would face whatever punishment Martha and the town authorities deemed appropriate for her unauthorized absence, and then she would wait for Aaron to make his next move. "How long?" Christina asked as they prepared to leave the cabin. "Not long," Aaron promised, though he wasn't entirely sure how he was going to keep that promise. "I have some things to arrange, some preparations to make, but I won't leave you waiting indefinitely." The journey back down the mountain was bittersweet for both of them. Every step took them further away from the brief paradise they'd found together and closer to the complications of the civilized world. But it also strengthened their resolve to find a way to be together permanently, regardless of the obstacles they faced. When they reached the point where Christina would continue alone, Aaron pulled her into his arms for what might be their last embrace for some time. "Remember what I told you when you were 8 years old," he said. "If you're ever in real trouble, call for me. I'll come." "I'll remember," Christina promised, then added with a smile that was both sad and hopeful. "But next time, I might not need rescuing. I might be ready to do some rescuing of my own." Aaron watched her walk away until she disappeared around a bend in the trail, then turned and began the long journey back to his cabin. He had work to do, plans to make, and a future to fight for. The solitary life he'd chosen 15 years ago was about to come to an end, and while the prospect was terrifying, it was also exhilarating. Christina's return to Millbrook caused exactly the uproar she'd expected. Martha was simultaneously relieved and furious. The town authorities were suspicious and demanding explanations, and the gossips were having a field day speculating about what the school teacher's ward had been doing alone in the mountains for 3 days. "How could you be so irresponsible?" Martha demanded during their first private conversation after Christina's return. "Do you have any idea how worried I was? How worried the entire town was?" "I'm sorry," Christina said, and she meant it. "I never intended to cause you pain, but I had to know, Martha. I had to find out if my feelings were real or just childhood fantasy." "And what did you discover?" Martha asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. "That they're real," Christina said simply. "That Aaron Patel is everything I remembered and more. That I love him and he loves me, and we want to build a life together." Martha sank into her chair, looking suddenly older than her years. "Oh, Christina," she said sadly, "what have you done?" "I found my happiness," Christina replied. "Isn't that what you've always wanted for me?" "I've wanted you to find happiness with someone appropriate," Martha said. "Someone who can give you a proper home, a respectable place in society, children who won't be ostracized for their father's reputation." "Aaron isn't a criminal," Christina said defensively. "He's a good man who chooses to live differently than most people. There's nothing shameful about that." "There's nothing shameful about it, but there's nothing practical about it either," Martha replied. "Christina, you're 18 years old. You've lived your entire adult life in civilization, surrounded by books and education and social interaction. Do you really think you could be happy living in isolation on a mountain, seeing no one but your husband from 1 month to the next?" It was a fair question, and one that Christina had asked herself repeatedly during her time at Aaron's cabin. But the answer came easily. "Yes," she said. "If it meant being with him, yes." Martha studied her ward's face, looking for signs of doubt or uncertainty. But Christina's expression was serene and determined, the look of someone who had found her true calling and wouldn't be swayed from it. "The town council wants to speak with you," Martha said finally. "There are questions about your disappearance, concerns about your association with Aaron Patel. Some people are suggesting that you might have been compromised in some way." Christina felt heat rise in her cheeks. "My virtue is intact, if that's what they're worried about," she said stiffly. "Aaron is a gentleman. He treated me with nothing but respect and kindness." "I'm glad to hear it," Martha said. "But you need to understand that your reputation has been damaged by this incident. Eric Hughes has withdrawn his offer of marriage, and other potential suitors are likely to follow suit. Your options for a conventional future are becoming limited." "Good," Christina said, surprising Martha with her vehemence. "I never wanted a conventional future anyway." The meeting with the town council was as unpleasant as Christina had expected. A panel of stern-faced men questioned her extensively about her time in the mountains, clearly hoping to uncover some scandal or impropriety that would justify their disapproval. But Christina answered their questions with dignity and composure, refusing to be intimidated by their obvious hostility. "The man you visited," Councilman Virginia Cruz said with obvious distaste, "he has a reputation for violence. There are stories about him threatening people, driving away visitors with weapons. Aren't you concerned about associating with someone so dangerous?" "Aaron Patel has never threatened me or made me feel unsafe in any way," Christina replied calmly. "If he's driven away visitors, it's probably because he values his privacy and doesn't appreciate uninvited guests." "Privacy is one thing," another councilman interjected, "but complete isolation from civilized society is something else entirely. What kind of life could you possibly have with such a man?" "A life of my own choosing," Christina answered, which is more than many women can say. The meeting ended with a formal censure of Christina's behavior and a warning that any future incidents would result in more serious consequences. Christina accepted their judgment with outward grace, but inwardly she was counting the days until Aaron would make his promised return to her life. Those days stretched into weeks, and the weeks into a month. Christina tried to maintain her normal routine, helping Martha with household duties and continuing her studies. But her heart wasn't in any of it. She found herself constantly watching the mountain trails, hoping to catch a glimpse of a familiar figure riding down from the high country. As time passed without word from Aaron, doubt began to creep into Christina's mind. Had he changed his mind about their relationship? Had the complications of her return to town convinced him that pursuing their romance wasn't worth the trouble? Had something happened to him in the dangerous mountain wilderness? The uncertainty was almost unbearable. Christina had never felt so helpless, so dependent on someone else's actions for her own happiness. She'd always been self-reliant and independent, but now she found herself in the unfamiliar position of waiting for a man to determine her future. Just when Christina was beginning to despair that she would ever see Aaron again, Martha burst into the house one afternoon with news that made her heart leap with excitement and terror in equal measure. "There's a man here to see you," Martha announced, her face flushed with what might have been embarrassment or anger. "Aaron Patel. He's standing on our front porch, bold as brass, asking for permission to court you properly." Christina felt the world tilt on its axis. "He's here? Now?" "He's here," Martha confirmed, dressed like a gentleman, clean-shaven, with flowers in his hand and pretty speeches on his lips. Half the town is gathered in the street watching the spectacle. Christina rushed to the window and peered out through the lace curtains. There indeed was Aaron Patel, but transformed almost beyond recognition. Gone were the rough mountain clothes and unkempt beard. In their place was a man dressed in a well-tailored suit, his hair neatly trimmed, his face clean-shaven to reveal the strong jawline she'd only glimpsed before. He looked like a successful businessman or prosperous rancher, someone who would fit comfortably into polite society. "How is this possible?" Christina whispered. "I have no idea," Martha replied, "but he's asking to speak with you and with me as your guardian. He says he has a proposal to make." Christina's hands trembled as she smoothed her skirts and checked her appearance in the hall mirror. Whatever Aaron was planning, it was clearly something he'd thought through carefully. The transformation in his appearance alone must have taken considerable time and effort. When she opened the front door, Aaron's eyes met hers with an intensity that made her knees weak. But there was also something new in his expression, a confidence and determination that spoke of a man who had made important decisions and was prepared to act on them. "Miss Hall," he said formally, offering her a small bouquet of wildflowers, "I hope you'll forgive my unexpected visit. I have something important to discuss with you and Miss Campbell." "Of course," Christina managed to say, accepting the flowers with hands that shook slightly. "Please, come in." Aaron followed her into Martha's parlor, his presence seeming to fill the small room despite his obvious efforts to appear civilized and unthreatening. Martha took her place in her favorite chair, clearly prepared to play the role of protective guardian to the hilt. "Mr. Patel," Martha said stiffly, "I must say I'm surprised to see you here. After the trouble Christina's last visit to your home caused, I would have thought you'd have the courtesy to stay away." "I understand your concerns, Miss Campbell," Aaron replied, his voice respectful but firm, "and I want to address them directly. I've come to ask for your permission to court Christina with the intention of marriage." Martha's eyebrows shot up toward her hairline. Marriage? Mr. Patel, surely you must realize how inappropriate such a proposal is. The difference in your ages, your circumstances, your way of life, it's simply not suitable. I disagree, Aaron said calmly. Christina is 18 years old, legally an adult capable of making her own decisions. As for our circumstances, I'm prepared to make significant changes to accommodate a wife. What kind of changes? Martha asked suspiciously. Aaron reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folded document. I've purchased property in Denver, he said, handing the paper to Martha. A house with modern conveniences, close to schools and churches and cultural institutions. I've also invested in several business ventures that will provide a steady income without requiring me to maintain my current, isolated lifestyle. Martha unfolded the document and read it with obvious astonishment. This is a deed to a property worth more than most people in this town will see in a lifetime, she said. Where did you get this kind of money? Aaron's smile was slightly embarrassed. I've been trapping and trading in these mountains for 15 years, Miss Campbell. I've also done some prospecting, with more success than most people realize. I may live simply, but I'm not poor. I've just never had reason to spend my money on anything beyond basic necessities. Christina stared at him in amazement. You're rich? I'm comfortable, Aaron corrected. Comfortable enough to provide for a wife in whatever style she chooses. If Christina wants to live in Denver society, attending parties and cultural events, she can have that. If she prefers a simpler life closer to nature, we can arrange that too. The important thing is that she has choices. Martha was clearly struggling to process this new information. The rough mountain man she'd been prepared to dismiss as unsuitable had just revealed himself to be a wealthy gentleman capable of providing Christina with every material comfort she could desire. Even if we accept that you have the financial means to support a wife, Martha said slowly, there are other considerations. Christina has been raised as a lady, educated in literature and music and social graces. She's accustomed to intellectual stimulation and cultural refinement. Can you provide those things? Aaron's answer surprised them both. I have a university education, Miss Campbell. I graduated from Harvard before the war, with degrees in literature and natural philosophy. I've continued my studies during my years in the mountains, corresponding with scholars and maintaining an extensive library. I may have chosen to live apart from society, but I haven't abandoned intellectual pursuits. The revelations kept coming, each one reshaping Christina's understanding of the man she'd fallen in love with. The mysterious mountain hermit was actually an educated gentleman who had chosen solitude for reasons he'd never fully explained. Why? Christina asked quietly. Why did you leave civilization behind if you had so much to offer it? Aaron's expression grew somber. The war changed me, he said simply. I saw too much death, too much cruelty, too much of humanity's capacity for evil. I needed time away from people, time to heal and remember what was good in the world. I thought it would be temporary, but years turned into decades, and I grew comfortable with my isolation. And now? Martha pressed. Aaron looked directly at Christina, his eyes warm with love and determination. Now I've remembered what's worth coming back for, he said. I found something more important than my need for solitude. The room fell silent as the weight of his words settled over them. Martha looked back and forth between Aaron and Christina, clearly struggling with the decision that would affect her ward's entire future. I need time to consider this, Martha said finally. This is all very sudden, and there are practical matters to discuss. Christina's feelings, the town's reaction, the logistics of such a significant change in her circumstances. Of course, Aaron agreed. I don't expect an immediate answer. But I hope you'll both know that my intentions are completely honorable. I love Christina, and I want to spend the rest of my life making her happy. As Aaron prepared to leave, Christina walked him to the door. How long can you stay in town? She asked quietly. As long as it takes, Aaron replied. I've taken rooms at the hotel, and I'm prepared to court you properly, with all the social conventions that entails. If that's what it takes to win your guardian's approval, then that's what I'll do. Christina felt tears prick her eyes at the sacrifice he was willing to make for her. She knew how difficult it must be for him to subject himself to the scrutiny in social expectations of town life after so many years of solitude. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. "About giving up your old life for me?" Aaron cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle but sure. "I'm not giving up anything that matters," he said. "I'm gaining everything I never knew I wanted." That evening, as Christina and Martha sat together discussing Aaron's unexpected proposal, the older woman found herself reconsidering all her assumptions about the mountain man she'd been prepared to dismiss. "He's not what I expected," Martha admitted. "I thought he was just a rough frontiersman with no understanding of civilized life. But he's clearly intelligent, well-educated, and financially secure. If his feelings for you are genuine—" "They are," Christina said with absolute certainty. "And mine for him are just as real." Martha studied her ward's face, seeing a happiness and determination that had been missing for months. "You really love him, don't you?" "More than I ever thought it was possible to love someone," Christina confirmed. "He saved my life when I was 8 years old, Martha. But that's not why I love him. I love him because he's kind and strong and honest. Because he makes me feel like I can be anything I want to be. Because when I'm with him, I feel like I'm finally home." Martha felt her resistance crumbling in the face of Christina's obvious sincerity. "If I give my blessing to this courtship," she said slowly, "you have to promise me that you'll take time to really get to know him. Not the memory you've carried all these years, but the real man. Marriage is a lifetime commitment, Christina. You need to be absolutely certain." "I promise," Christina said. "But I think you'll find that the real Aaron Patel is even better than any memory could be." And so began the most unusual courtship in Millbrook's history. Aaron Patel, the mysterious mountain hermit, became a regular fixture in the town's social life, escorting Christina to church services, community gatherings, and cultural events. His transformation from rough wilderness dweller to polished gentleman was so complete that many townspeople had trouble believing he was the same man they'd heard whispered stories about for years. The courtship lasted 3 months, during which Aaron proved himself to be everything he'd claimed and more. He was intelligent, well-read, financially secure, and completely devoted to Christina's happiness. More importantly, he showed infinite patience with the social conventions he'd avoided for so long, subjecting himself to the scrutiny and judgment of people whose opinions had never mattered to him before. For Christina, those 3 months were a revelation. She discovered that her childhood memories of Aaron had been accurate but incomplete. The man she'd fallen in love with as a child had grown into someone even more remarkable, someone whose depth of character and strength of purpose exceeded even her most romantic fantasies. When Aaron finally asked for her hand in marriage, kneeling formally in Martha's parlor with a ring that must have cost him a small fortune, Christina's answer was immediate and joyful. "Yes," she said, pulling him to his feet and into her arms. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." The wedding was planned for the following spring, giving the couple time to finalize their plans for their life together. They decided to split their time between the Denver house and a smaller cabin Aaron would build in the mountains, allowing Christina to experience both civilized society and the wilderness that had shaped the man she loved. As their wedding day approached, Christina often found herself marveling at the strange turns her life had taken. The lost little girl who had been rescued from a mountain storm had grown up to rescue her rescuer in return, bringing him back from his self-imposed exile and into the warmth of human connection. But it was on their wedding day, as she stood at the altar beside the man who had saved her life and won her heart, that Christina truly understood the magnitude of what they had found together. This wasn't just a marriage. It was the completion of a story that had begun 23 years earlier in a cave during a blizzard, when a lonely mountain man had chosen compassion over convenience and changed both their lives forever. As Aaron slipped the ring onto her finger and spoke the words that would bind them together for life, Christina felt the last pieces of her childhood puzzle clicking into place. She was no longer a lost girl in need of rescue. She was a woman who had found her destiny in the arms of the man who had always been meant to be hers. And when Aaron whispered, "I came to marry you, Christina Hall, because you're the lost girl I rescued decades ago, and you've been the missing piece of my heart ever since," she knew that some love stories are worth waiting a lifetime to complete. The wind that had brought them together as strangers now witnessed their union as husband and wife, carrying their vows up into the mountains where their love had first taken root and where it would continue to grow for all the years to come.